I said, I want to thank, well, I'll start that over. Buzu nin angwing mitfi yin IEB. That is a giveaway for hello, and I want to thank you for being here this evening. My name is Walk the Pond Scorched Earth, which in Ojibwe is Inose Beke Jaki Aki. Just a little background about how I came to be in the SCA and decided to go this route as far as personas go. Um, Mundanely, I am a registered member of the Katoa Band of Cherokee in Oklahoma, but I am a recognized member of the Milok Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota outside of St. Cloud. My paternal grandmother was almost full-blooded Ojibwe. My paternal grandfather was almost full-blooded Cherokee. And then my mother was Métis. She was French in Micmac, which is a First Nations tribe. I'm sure that some people of you have heard of them before. Basically, I started to delve into this as a way to like honor my heritage, but also kind of get the knowledge to a wider audience for things we can share that aren't considered sacred among our peoples. So somewhere between 1505 and 1507, the French make contact with indigenous tribes on the Newfoundland and Labrador Islands off the coast of Canada. 1509 to 1530, mostly coastal trading with the tribes on Labrador and Newfoundland, such as Micmac, Innu, and Inuit. And later the southern bound of the Inuit that came from further up north. When we really start to see them move into the interior of Canada, so like Montreal and Toronto, is around 1545. And this is what we know as the French fur trapper, or the Coeur de Bois. They start to migrate. Mostly, I think a lot of it has to do with the fur industry on those islands was starting to get outstripped, so they were having to find other sources. And they also were starting to go down into what is now modernly known as Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There were several tribes that aligned themselves with the French. A lot of it had to do with household goods they were willing to trade for the furs. We're talking like metal needles, buttons, cotton, things that they didn't have access necessarily, but were ways to make their life easier, as I've heard. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but economically, it made sense. From 1590 to 1730 is where we're going to see the height of trading between the Europeans, French specifically, in Canada and the Indigenous people. One of my favorite things that I kind of stumbled upon was from 1578 specifically. There was the Marquis de la Roche, who received a fur trade monopoly to New France from the king. He landed with a party of 40 colonists on Sable Island off the coast of Canada. When they came back 5 years later, only 11 of them were still alive. The primary ones that we're going to see that they're actually trading with early on with the French and Indigenous people are going to be the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. And they belong to what's called the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And they actually were the ones that started to establish trading like rights with other indigenous tribes and the French, which is actually kind of where the Ojibwe come in the Council of the Three Fires later on in that trading. So the Iroquois people established trade routes with the French prior to the British influence. The British actually didn't have a lot of luck in Canada establishing the fur trade. They had to go down to the States around the Hudson Bay. And the name Iroquois actually isn't what they call themselves. That is a French coined term, which means they who smoke or happy whoops or sad cries. Has several spellings depending on what you read as far as resources go. So the Great Confederacy of the Iroquois, as they call it, was founded between 1450 and 1660 by what they called the Great Peacemaker. And like I said, the Confederacy facilitated trade between the French and British with other tribes starting in the late 1500s, really peaked in like 1645, which so the Iroquois actually refer to themselves as the Haudenosaunee, or people who are building the longhouse. And I apologize to anyone. I don't speak Iroquois, but I am trying to do the best I can with my knowledge. Um, does anybody have any questions so far? All right, so we are actually going to move on to the tribe that I know about, the Ojibwe, or as they call it in the United States, the Chippewa. The band that I am a recognized member of actually prefers the word Ojibwe. Um, so the lands they occupied in the late 1500s were Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the states modernly known as Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. They actually ended up pushing the Lakota Sioux out of their territorial lands during this whole expansion of the French fur trade. Um, I will say the first mention of the Ojibwe in any kind of like wide range text is the French Jesuit relation of 1640. Um, and many of them, due to the fact that they were located near the the outlet of Lake Superior, the French actually dubbed them the Salters. Um, I mean, there are things. Sorry, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. I apologize. Uh, please feel free to ask any questions. Um, uh, excuse me, I'm gonna get a drink. Um, so as far as the relationship between the French and the indigenous people, they were actually much more kind to them than some of their counterparts, such as the British. Because many of the French fur trappers would actually marry into some of the tribes that they traded with quite a bit, which kind of leads to the creation of what people call métis today. Um, give me one moment, I apologize. Sorry about that. I had to clear my throat. um, but what you're going to see especially with the Ojibwe and some of the other tribes, once they have these European goods introduced, you're going to see a lot more of what we consider modern um, dress. You're going to see the skirts and things like that. They're going to actually move away from using the skins of the animals that they were catching. The so the Ojibwe actually were known for their birchback canoes, which is you'll actually see those if you're looking at French trapper history. You'll see a lot of those, and that's where they got that idea from. Um, so, does anyone have any questions?
This one is a little bit off the topic, but since you started at like 1500s, like how do some of the even earlier natives match up with that? Like I know that like the Beothuk were in Newfoundland, like that's why I was here for the class was I was hoping to hear more about that. Have you done anything with that? Or like they're extinct now, or not extinct, but like it's not a culture anymore, but I wasn't
Yeah.
sure.
So I've touched a little bit on that. And that is actually something that is interesting to me, and I would like to dig deeper into. Um, to kind of talk about uh, like some of the ones that have been affected, due to whether it's they're moved out of their cultural lands, disease, or whatever the case may be, or intermarrying into society. When in fact, reducing the numbers for the tribal requirements. And it is something you see more commonly in the United States than you would like in Canada, I find, at least in my experience. But obviously, any of my Canadian friends, please tell me otherwise because I love to learn as well.
And my question was about like traditional foods of the various peoples, and obviously, the French influence is going to be heavy there. But I was wondering if there was a influence the other way, if French cuisine at the time was influenced by the native peoples.
Um, so I have seen some crossover, but what you're going to typically see that with are the trappers that are starting to integrate into the tribal communities. So
Mm-hmm.
they're bringing their influence, but then they're being influenced because it was a lot of, wild game, fish, dry, berries, things like that they could do. The
According
one
to
influ
Catholics, beavers are fish.
Yes, I don't quite understand that as someone, but hey, if it goes in the water, I guess it's a fish.
Vashti
Um,
has a question in the chat. She's curious what the status was like for French marrying into the indigenous tribes. Who were they marrying? Where do they fit into society initially?
so many of them were marrying indigenous women. So specifically, like on my mother's side, I can say I found where my French ancestry entered Quebec. Like he integrated from France and he married into the Mi'kmaq tribe. Um, so if they proved themselves to be capable, then they were higher in society. It really was very much a uh, how capable were they? Could they provide for their wife and eventual children if they had children? Um, how could they provide for their wife's family? Because that was also an expectation. Just with the matrilineal lineage that does occur, you see in Native American cultures. Um, Something else you see a little bit later, post period for us at least, are what they call Hudson Bay blankets. Um, and these actually didn't originate with the Hudson Bay Company, but they were traded. It was a weaving practice among some of the indigenous tribes they found that they traded them for, but because they were seeing them with so many of the trappers that were trading with the Hudson Bay, they kind of got that moniker. Um, does anybody else have any other questions?
I have one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Did the trappers and the traders precede the religious missionaries, or did they come at about the same time?
So I am seeing that the religious missionaries actually came after the fur trappers, because when they first hit the coast, like Labrador Island and Newfoundland, they were like, "Oh wow, here's this just cash crop of skins." And while it was not the peak that beaver hats were the most popular, those were definitely later in period. They saw a new economic market. But from what I can tell, the as far as the religious aspect of it, that came much later.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because that's a hot topic in Canada right now. So, thanks.
You're welcome. Um, so kind of one of the books I read and I found really interesting, it was actually kind of hard to find, was the fur trade canoe routes of Canada. Um, and I could only find it in Canada, so I had to request it from a library there, which took a minute for it to get me here in the States. But it has some really interesting maps in it where you show how that versus the French versus the Indigenous, and the Indigenous actually influencing the patterns, the fur trade patterns they're seeing throughout the provinces.
Hey, I see another question in the chat. I hope I'm not interrupting at an awkward time. Vashti follows up with that you mentioned matrilineal society. Is that just tracing heritage lines, or was that economic / political power as well? And what were gender roles like?
So gender roles were actually kind of traditional. Not to say that there weren't recognized warrior women within the society. Being two-spirit is not a new or a new theory for a lot of Indigenous people. And they would recognize this in a person, and then those people would assume those traditional roles. A lot of the women actually they had a lot of power. I know, at least for my family, while technically my line was broken with our Cherokee clan, and we would be considered clanless, we were actually adopted back into our clan because just of the history that my family had within the Cherokee tribe. And so for that, women actually had a huge amount of power in society. Um, and then it was very much they could divorce a man if he couldn't provide, or if he was he would hit his woman, or if he was a bad father, or he was less than honorable. She could divorce him, and typically they were exiled out of that clan within the tribe. They would have to go either back to their original family, or they would have to find another tribe to join.
Do you mean the divorced woman or the man that she had divorced?
The man.
Oh, awesome.
So typically what would happen is the man would go to the woman's family, and he would live with her clan. But like I said, if he did not prove to be honorable or a good husband, or whatever the case may be, then he would get kicked out. Um, does anybody have any other questions? So, let me see here. Trying to just. So for this, I mean, at least as far as I know, and everybody's experience was a little bit different, but from the journals I've read that are post period, but kind of referencing that time, that very much of those that the women would be the one to like facilitate the trading with the French fur trappers, um, depending on their status and things like that. Because there was one journal that I read where they were referencing a woman chief, because and she was the one that was actually doing a lot of the negotiating with the French. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little tidbit that I found. Okay, let's see here. I saw another one that Vashti put on the on the chat. Um, so the Ojibwe specifically, I can speak to. They built wigwams, and typically they were multi-family dwellings, um, and everything but the man's personal items belonged to the woman. So the house, the children, the food, it all belonged to the woman. The only things that did not belong to her were his weapons and his shield. Those belonged to him, but everything else was directly connected to the wife and was hers. Any more questions? I have done some research on that actually. That's a pretty interesting topic that I could probably talk about for a little bit too. I am happy to send you those resources that I have found if you would like. Um,
Oh, sure. I'll go ahead and speak to that one. I was asking about the contacts with the Acadian settlers before they were all removed to Louisiana. I've done a little bit of research, and actually, one of the Micmac wives was part of the removal. And in part of the letters to the kings of France to get some help for the Acadian settlers, she's one of the ones mentioned in his letter saying, oh, this poor woman, she's out of her element here in Louisiana. She's used to, the far north.
she's like, it's hot and humid.
Yeah. Got a bunch of kids. It's a mess.
Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, so Nessa just asked a very interesting question. And it was, if the women owned everything, then what were the courting processes or like a premarital contract? So typically what you're going to find with that is he's going to bring her family a side of meat, some fish. He's going to show that he is a good hunter. He's going to show that he has the ability to build things. So before they're married, he will actually start to build a wigwam, as where they spend their marriage night to prove that he can take care of his wife. He will do the family typically will give him like a list of feats he must accomplish or things he must accomplish before they will accept the marriage offer. Um, so uh, and then pretty much anything after that, anything he made, anything he gathered or hunted became the woman's, because that's what his job was to provide her with children and prove that he was a good provider. Any other questions?
Can you speak at all to languages? And I'm just going to kind of open that up generally for whatever you might want to say. So, were there indigenous languages that were mutually intelligible between the different groups? Did the Europeans, make an effort to learn the indigenous languages? Did the indigenous folks make an effort to learn the European languages? And any development of like pidgin languages?
Excuse me. So they kind of, it was very much a pidgin language. Especially the French fur trappers that integrated into the tribe, they definitely make an effort to speak their wife's tongue so that they would understand. I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence of, except for a few that like indigenous people who migrated into white society learning French, like learning full French, being fluent in it. I see a lot of references to them kind of smashing all the languages together for whether that was the Mi'kmaq, the Inuit, or even in later periods, the Iroquois and the Ojibwe. They just kind of smashed them together and hope for the best. Um, and I definitely can see that like really causing some definite issues. Um, so because like Ojibwe specifically is an Algonquian language. Uh, and so it actually does have some very similar sounds to some French words. There's a whole bunch of letters in there that we, in fact, do not use. um, I've jokingly once compared it to German as well, because depending on the mood that the person's in, it can sound a little like German. Um, I remember once my grandmother was very upset with me as a small child, and I thought she was yelling German at me, and it was in fact not. It was Ojibwe. And then she threw her shoe because that's what grandmas do. um, I did not, admittedly, for me, I did not get as much exposure to the Ojibwe side until later in my life. And I'm actually kind of reconnecting with some of those roots. Because when my grandfather and my grandmother married, her family disowned her. Because at that time, they wanted her to marry a white guy, and she didn't. So she married a cowboy from Oklahoma who told everybody he was Mexican. So, um, and so yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing, because language is always an interesting thing, really. Is there something you want me to expand upon that?
No, I was just interested in, whatever general knowledge you might have about that area. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, so Jennifer just asked an interesting question. The phrase "provide her with children" is interesting. Was infertility considered to default to the male in the same way it is considered the woman's fault in much of? Yes, it was actually considered the man's fault if he could not provide his wife with children. It was not assumed that it was the woman's fault, since they did hold such such power within the indigenous society. Um, so they did. They considered it to be a problem with the male aspect of that versus the female aspect.
So could she divorce him if he didn't provide her with children?
Yes, he actually could, Nessa.
Sorry.
You're good. You're all good.
So did if he couldn't provide for her and she divorced him, who paid I mean, did they have anything like child support, or, who took care of the children? They belonged to her, but
Traditionally, what would happen at that point is her uncle actually would step in to take over that role. Not in the physical sense of like they were married to each other, but he would help provide for her family, help raise her children, especially the male ones, because at a certain point, once they hit puberty, they actually were separated so that from their mothers, so they could go and focus on learning how to fight and gather and be a successful part of society.
So there seems to be a lot of focus on, members' ability to provide to uh, what about disabled peoples? How are they treated in society?
So in many ways, somebody with a disability was typically actually seen as an honored person within Indigenous society. And so their families would take care of them. They were provided for. And if they didn't have any family, like say that, their family unfortunately had passed or whatever the case may be, their clan would actually step in to help take care of them to make sure that their needs were met. Because they recognized that was also just part of a thing that occurred that was beyond their control as far as disabilities go. But they never shamed it. I know, at least in the Ojibwe society, from what I can tell and what I've been told, is they hold a very high place of honor, and not necessarily because they could be effective in the sense that they could provide, but that they had strong magic, and unfortunately, it was so strong it manifested itself in a way of a disability.
So what about like young men that were disabled? Would they be able to take a wife?
It would depend on the disability.
Mm.
It really would depend on the disability. Only because they were at that point they recognized that maybe mentally that person didn't have the mental capacity to consent to something like that. And they were just taken care of by their family, given roles where they still felt like they could provide something, but also at the same time be taken care of, provided for.
So I've studied a lot about the Plains Indians and the different sign languages that the different groups used among themselves, and it's just a fascinating topic. Was there any are you aware of if there was any kind of a signed language in the Atlantic Northwest, in that or Northeast, where that interaction was happening?
So I have seen mention of that in a journal I read, that there was signed languages that they used to help communicate. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
No,
I can.
I'd be interested in the article so that I can put that in with my other research that I've done on the topic. So if you can remember it and send it to me, that would be awesome.
I will definitely do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Vashti asked a question in the chat. When young men are separated from their mothers to go learn the men things, what does separated mean? They went out and learned to hunt and build stuff, and they come home. So to answer your question, they would leave for a period of time until they entered adulthood. But at this point, they were being formed to be warriors, and they actually would live in a large wigwam with the other young men around their age that were also in this journey. But once they reached what would be considered adulthood, then at that point they would start to integrate back into their clans more full time. That's not to say that they didn't ever see their families. They would see them at celebrations or different festivals that would happen. They just were kind of set apart so that they could focus. So it was more, I don't know, I would almost consider it like, say, someone goes to study to be a monk or a nun or something like that. So kind of that equivalency, if you will. Yeah, I just saw your comment there, Arnbjorn. Yeah, you are correct. The Eastern Great Lakes nations often had multifamily longhouses with palisades. That is in fact correct, depending on the size of the town. Um, Does anybody else have any other questions?
What were you've mentioned multifamily housing and the tribes and everything else. What was the standard size for a village when the French came over? What's the standard size? What's the population like that we're talking about?
So it depends, honestly. Because I mean, I don't think there's a fixed number that I could point you to say, oh yes, that number constitutes a village. Because some could be as small as 15, and some could be as large as several hundred, close to 1,000, depending on what branch they were.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then Vashti had a question about, so how do they determine when a young man is an adult and ready to integrate back into the clan? Is there a test, a ceremony? So there is a test/ceremony that they have, and it differs per tribe, and what it's named and the things that happen within it, to determine if they're ready to take that next step into adulthood.
Do you have any idea what that entailed?
So out of respect for my cultures that I belong to, I can't disclose that information. I know some of it, but I
Fair
cannot
enough.
disclose it.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Does anyone else have any other questions? Unfortunately, that's really all I've got for you, unless there's other questions. Okay, so Vashti's asked another question. Is there equivalent ceremonial process for marking the transition to adulthood for women? Not in the sense of what a man would go through to mark him as a warrior. Typically, it's when they reach menses, is when they are going from being a child to being an adult. There are rare cases where there's been an exception because they got it strangely very young. And so then they were like, yes, this actually, you're not an adult yet because you're too young and something has occurred. And I think to kind of go back to another question somebody asked about providing children, that genetically speaking, Indigenous people have a lower fertility rate. And so either their children, they would have trouble getting pregnant, or their children would die very young in infancy. And so I think that's why there was such a focus on it. A thing was so that culture didn't die out or, cease to exist, if you will.
Uh, Does your research, have you found anything as far as like crime rates among the Indigenous population and punishments? And did they have capital punishment? What did that look like? Have you run across anything?
So typically with that, it's going to depend on the severity of the crime. Theft, murder, things like that, you were just exiled completely. And you were sent away. And then any of the clans or tribes that were close were sent messengers to let them know of the deeds you had done and that you were dishonorable. So I've not seen anything specifically said capital punishment, but there's been a lot of banishment.
And did any of that change when the Europeans came that you've been able to find?
So I've seen slight references to it, but nothing concrete that I've can say for sure that I've seen. That's kind of an avenue I'm still going down to see how that changed, because a lot of indigenous people already had a governmental body established in very many ways. Um, they had what would be considered religious rites and ceremonies before their contact with the Europeans.
I guess related to that, what would be considered theft? I mean, what were the concepts of personal property as compared to Europeans?
So they considered theft because they didn't really have a concept of like of owning anything, which I think leads, in when it comes to signing treaties and like that, it leads to some, misconceptions. Um, a lot of it had to do with theft in their mind was, did it injure another party by what you took? So was that you ate too much? Did you steal someone's meat and say it was, take credit for it and say that it was your hunt? Things like that, I would say, is what they would consider theft. Um, honestly, and one of the things I did see, and this was kind of interesting to me, is they also considered stealing another man's wife theft. Um, even and it went both ways, because if they took adultery very seriously, even though they didn't have the modern concept of marriage, but in their minds they're like, okay, this is who I'm with, this is my life mate, this is, the other half of who's going to help me produce children, who's going to help me live this life. And that was a very like sacred thing. And so stealing another person's spouse, for lack of a better term, was considered a very high level of theft.
Yeah, that makes sense because there's a lot of mutual aid in that pairing.
Exactly. Um, okay, so Vashi just asked a question in the chat. Do you know if the legal consequences were different for Indigenous people versus the French trappers they interacted with when not intermarried? Was there a us versus them concept, or were they all subject to the same consequences? Um, so for as far as like with them interacting, they very much expected them to be honorable and be honest with their business dealings, if you will. So they very much held the French trappers they interact with, even if they weren't intermarried, to the same their standards of theft, of being dishonorable, being dishonest. Because at that point they still did not have a European concept of what of consequences. Any other questions?
I have one more.
Yeah, feel free,
Can
please.
can you speak at all to the introduction of alcohol to the Indigenous people? Was that something that occurred during the SCA period, or was that more of a post-period trade thing?
So they already had so they already had forms of alcohol that they created with products here in the continent of what is considered North America. It didn't have a very high alcohol content. We did see the introduction of alcohol with the French fur trappers. Unfortunately, it is a thing. It's I wish it wasn't, but it is a thing. But yes, we do see the introduction of different alcohols to the indigenous people from the French. Um,
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Nobody leave yet. I will be dropping a link for Rush class credit in the chat, so don't go.
So one last question then about the
Okay.
alcohol thing is that the indigenous population had a weaker, for lack of a better word, a weaker type of alcohol. And have you found what were the reasons? Was it just did the French, did the Europeans come over and introduce alcohol to take advantage of them because they thought it was funny? Have you found much along those lines?
I
Um,
I
you
don't
know what
think
I'm
they did it.
talking about?
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily did it for mockery per se. I think that it was just such a part of their own life, um, part of everyday French life for them, that they were just like, it didn't occur to them that that was not something that maybe wasn't standard among the indigenous people. Because a lot of what they were making was using local berries with a fermenting process. But it wasn't it was a quick ferment versus a long-term ferment they would find in like wines or of whiskey or something of that nature, which led to the lower alcohol content.
Just to follow up on all the question about fermentables. So what were the role fermenting is a natural organic process that happens that humans harness to poison ourselves, and there is no reason to doubt that it happened in the Americas as well. What were the roles in or are the roles in indigenous society of fermenting things, regardless of whether it was used for alcohol consumption specifically or not, before and during early contact with European settlers?
A lot of it was ceremonial. A lot of it was very much ceremonial in nature. Um, so so that's what we're seeing is it's a lot for rituals or ceremonies or festivals, things where there was a natural bent of celebration for the indigenous people. It wasn't an everyday thing that they drank. Um, so I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, going earlier in period, I do kind of find it somewhat humorous. One of the points of conflict between the Norse and the native peoples was the belief that the Norse were trying to poison the natives when they had introduced milk to them and
uh,
discovered they were lactose intolerant.
yes. So as someone of indigenous descent, I can in fact still confirm that we do not like milk. um, we just it has to do with the fact that there are not a lot of animals that we may have hunted or had access to that had that particular protein.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's where you're going to kind of to see that. And I can see how they would think that maybe somebody was trying to poison them. Any more questions before we wrap this up for the evening, folks?
So your name is Walks Upon Scorched Earth,
Yes.
and is there a short version of that? Like in
Uh,
like like Lilu. Sorry.
no, you're fine. You're perfectly fine. Honestly, I wish. Honestly, there's not really a good short version of that. Um, this will be, this is one of my personas in the SEA. I will answer to everything, but don't call me late for dinner, if you will. But honestly, if you just call me NSA, that will be fine with me. That is the easiest way to shorten that, because that'll get my attention and I'll know what you mean if we see each other in an event.
Now say that again, please. Inase?
Inose. Yeah, Inose.
Inose.
Yep.
Inose. Thank you
Um,
very much.
not a problem. It's a short I versus a long I. um,
So before everybody leaves, I just want to flag for you, Inase, about the folks who put in their email, both at the beginning of class and now, because I will not have access to the chat once this closes. So go ahead and grab those emails.
I already
So
screenshotted them. I've already
awesome.
got them.
Love that. Thank you. Amazing. And also for, I also sent you a link for filling out for class attendance for you for your class. And for anybody who wants class credit, there's also a link in the chat for filling that out. It's just a Google form. It's super quick and easy. And just please click that link and fill that out. And that's all.
Thank you, everybody, for doing this for us. This has been great.
Thank you,
Inase,
everyone.
for teaching. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.